Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Justin Warland. I am a senior correspondent at Time, where I write about climate and energy. This meeting is on the future of U.S. climate and energy policy, part of the CFR's Transition 2025 series, which examines all of the major foreign policy issues facing the new administration. So much has happened in the last month and a half, and so normally I might say we're going to dig into all of that, but I think we're going to dig into a small fraction of that with this really great panel. And so going across the stage, we have Alice Hill, who is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at Council on Foreign Relations. And I should say, all of these people have very long resumes. I'm just going to read one or two things from each of them. And then next we have Michael Catanzaro, who is the CEO of CGCN Group and was Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Energy and Environmental Policy at the White House National Economic Council from 2017 to 2018. And then finally on stage, we have Drew Bond, who's the President and CEO of C3 Solutions, former Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy, 2007 to 2008. And then we have joining virtually David Hayes. Yeah, we can see David on the far end there. Who's a professor of practice at the Dorr School of Sustainability at Stanford Law School, former special assistant to the president for climate policy from 2021 to 2022. I think you heard the housekeeping at the top, but we're going to have a 30-minute moderated discussion, maybe a little longer. Then we're going to go to the audience for questions. So please be thinking of questions. And as a reminder, this event is on the record. So, opening question, I think, just to get us started to everyone. Obviously, President Trump entered office with a lot of bold policy declarations, maneuvers, declared an energy emergency, pulled the U.S. Out of the Paris Agreement. Last night, during the joint address to Congress, he declared an end to the Green New Scam. So there's a lot happening, but just to sort of set the stage, how do you all separate the signal from the noise amid all of this? And then what is the signal that emerges for each of you out of everything that's happening? And we can just go across the line for this one.
Well, we are seeing a lot of activity, and sometimes it's hard to discern from that activity what the path is. I think there are a couple of very clear things. The U.S. is not going to be a player in the international arena on climate. And because it's not going to be a player, that probably has very significant consequences for the amount of carbon that will enter into the atmosphere. We're the largest historical emitter, and certainly the second largest emitter now. And what we do matters, given that we are the world's largest producer of oil and the largest exporter of natural gas. So we'll see a turn back, I think, on global efforts to cut pollution around the atmosphere. So that's not noise. That, I think, is going to happen. And directly as a result of that, the temperatures will continue to rise, and we will see far greater disasters, which will have knock-on effects for national security, migration, and economic growth. The noise is really what we saw last night. What will the tariffs mean for this push for a drill, baby, drill? What will we see in terms of decisions made for things that we don't think that would be caught in this sweep, but firefighting capacity, for example, in a hotter world? So there are lots of changes taking place, hard to keep up for everyone. And then they're on top of the decisions that are announced, they're the reversals of the decisions, which means that you may not be accurate at every moment. But I think it's clear that the world, as a result of President Trump's decision, is taking a step back on cutting its emissions.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. Yeah, that certainly has been a lot of activity. It's been tough to keep up with. I will say that I feel like in this country, if you're in business, you're trying to make, investments over the long term, which we know in the energy sector, that's what they do. Particularly, if you're trying to say build power plants or other things that require a lot of capital investment and planning. It's really tough because we're now at a point, we've been at this point, I think, for some time where Congress is basically in a backseat. Congress will take up, the president's sort of one or two top legislative priorities, pass those, and then basically get off the playing field. But for the most part, businesses have to deal with regulations of one sort or another and policies coming out of the executive branch. And what we have now is a system of governance whereby you have one administration that comes in, one party, and they do a whole bunch of things, and they usually look backward and they try to figure out, well, what came before us? And if it was a different party, different administration from a different party, then we're going to try to undo everything that they did as quickly as we possibly can and then move on to the more affirmative aspects of our agenda. So President Biden did when he looked back in the first term of President Trump is what President Trump is doing right now and looking back at 4 years of President Biden. So what you get then is these early stage executive orders. And executive orders serve a couple of functions. One, they're messaging tools that are good in terms of a president demonstrating to the public that you're taking quick action, you're trying to follow through on campaign promises. They're also good internally for executive branch personnel to understand what it is they're supposed to be doing, when they're supposed to be doing it by, what the framework is for decision-making. But they can't change statutes. And that's why they can be taken off the books as quickly as they can be put on the books. And so where we are now is executive orders seem to be signed almost on an hourly basis. But at the end of the day, what really matters is the policy implementation and how all that plays out. And you can have a lot of rhetoric and you can have a lot of activity and a lot of noise. But at the end of the day, when you look at the agencies, they got to go through complex, time-consuming processes under the Administrative Procedure Act and other statutes. And that takes time. And I know the president declared an energy emergency using his executive order authority under the National Emergencies Act, and that may try to move some things along faster, but I'm not sure that it can at the end of the day because a number of those authorities do take time to effectuate. You're going to have lawsuits and litigation. And so as much as I think the administration wants to move forward as quickly as they possibly can and show bold action as quickly as they can, and they will try to do it, there are obstacles built into the system that only Congress, I think, can really remove or change or streamline in order to meet the challenges that we face today, whether it's climate, whether it's energy resiliency, grid reliability, new technology, innovation. It can't be all solved by any one administration or series of administrations. As I say, we've got this pendulum that swings back and forth. And so it's very hard to maintain that sort of true north right down the middle. How can we plan over the long term for the 21st century so that America can win this energy race that we're in with, particularly with China? AI is a huge issue. We all know that. So huge challenges, but doing this just by presidential diktat or doing this just through the regulatory apparatus, I don't think is going to be enough. You got to have both executive will and authority combined with congressional will and authority, particularly through legislation. So we'll see how this plays out. But really, at the end of the day, Congress has to step up to make some of the changes that I think the president wants to stick over time. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's the noise and then there's reality. And the noise is, as Alice alluded to, that this president and this Congress is not leaning into climate. And they're not leaning into climate in terms of the agenda. But I will say the reality is I think we're in a place where we can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions faster than we've ever done before. We did it with natural gas, not to save the climate, but because the economic opportunity existed. And so I think under this administration, whether Trump wants to or not, currently the answer is not. He's not trying to be the next great climate president, but he in fact could be. If we take this national emergency order and these executive orders to really reduce regulations, I mean, I think we can all agree that the system as it was previously wasn't working. We are not able to build fast enough. And when I read that the national energy emergency, while the top line narrative in the media was all about oil and gas and drill, baby, drill, when you read the actual language of that, it's all about infrastructure. It's all about really more wires and how do we build faster. I am an eternal optimist. I look under this next 4 years and think we've got tremendous opportunity to not only build more and invest more in the United States, but also do it in a way that is cleaner and cleaner over time. I look at Chris Wright being the Secretary of Energy, someone that knows energy, knows geology, knows science, knows business. And he, together with, Secretary Burgum and Secretary, Director of the EPA, Lee Zeldin, together with the environmental task force that's being created. I just think there's a lot of momentum. I don't disagree with Mike. At the end of the day, Congress has to move, and maybe with Trump having the authority that he has, particularly with this Congress, Congress will move perhaps faster than they have in the past.
We're going to pull on this thread of President Trump as an inadvertent climate leader, so maybe in a bit. But okay, so David, over to you.
Thanks. So there's certainly a lot of noise, and it is difficult to know what's noise and what's real. And I hope that Drew is right, but I'm not sure. And there are some things that are happening now that are not noise, that are significant. And Alice mentioned withdrawing from Paris, for example. That's not just a question of a headline. It is going to take the United States out of the global discussion around what to do about this existential crisis. I also would say that some of the early moves are that also provide headlines are not noise, and I'm thinking in particular of the massive firings that are happening in some of the agencies that are super important in terms of addressing climate and addressing energy. We can talk about this more later, but obviously NOAA, for example, and their leading edge science, their ability to address and anticipate major climate impacts, et cetera. We're losing muscle there. We're losing muscle in agencies that are doing permitting for important infrastructure projects, for example. And I am concerned, and we'll talk about this, I think, in a second, Justin, when perhaps we talk about the emergency order. I'm concerned that the message that comes through on the emergency order for energy in removing solar energy and solar, wind, and storage as a domestic energy resource that deserves priority is going to have ramifications, and we're already seeing it. We're seeing stoppage of funding to clean energy projects. As Drew suggested, there's no reason why you have to conflate a reluctance to lean in on climate, as he put it, with stopping clean energy, which is on its own merits as what has become the cheapest new energy source that is proving out as very popular. Almost all of the new energy coming on the grid is clean energy. Having that clean energy now conflated with climate, I think, is a very unfortunate and dangerous and needlessly unfortunate situation. But perhaps that conflation will recede, but I'm concerned that it may not.
Well, thank you, David. And I think so. Let's pull on this emergency executive order, the thread of this a little bit. Maybe just to start, how big of a deal is this? Where do you see this actually unlocking new authorities? Where do you see this sort of falling short, maybe getting litigated such that it doesn't matter? And then how do you see those authorities being put to work? Maybe, I guess, Drew, would be good to hear from you how they might be put to work in a way that's positive, especially considering, as David said, solar and wind are excluded. And then David, maybe you can respond to that, perhaps offer a little pushback if you feel that's appropriate.
Yeah, I think again, it's energy. If you look at the executive order, most of it is about electricity more than liquid fuels, and and so, we need wires, we need transmission, we need distribution, we need resiliency of these infrastructure. And so that is an area where, if nothing else, it's a top line message to FERC and to the state agencies that we need to get moving faster. And I think the utilities know this quite well with the advent of the data centers and how energy hungry AI is. So, I think it's in some ways, I know the world was scratching its head when that declaration was issued, because we are rich with energy in America. But again, I think it was more about how do we actually deploy energy faster and have it be more resilient in the United States, given the growth of AI and other energy sources. I think the opportunities exist specifically within the executive authority on places like national lab lands and DoD military base lands. And this is where, in the past, previous administrations had tried to deploy new technologies to prove them at military bases, for instance. I think what the opportunity now with the Trump administration is not to deploy unproven technologies, but to deploy proven technologies at military bases. So here specifically, I'm talking about enhanced geothermal. Small modular nuclear is, somewhat new on the scene, but nuclear is, not new. And then even solar plus batteries. So what is off the shelf that we can deploy quickly, that is, 24/7 reliable energy? And I would put solar and batteries in that. Full disclosure, I have a solar company. So before you think I'm anti-renewable, I'm not. I just believe in the fact that every form of energy has a trade-off, and we have to make practical decisions about where those energy best fit. So, if it were me, I think the opportunity is, let's issue a categorical exclusion for all clean energy on all military base and national lab lands. Those two have several things in common. They have a lot of land. They are grid connected. They literally have fences and guards and gates, so they are secure, and they use a lot of energy. And so you could do that in such a way where the government were actually able to simply issue an RFP and let the industry compete for where those best fit. They're not going to fit everywhere because some of the labs are so remote that they're really, not near the loads, but you could put the loads near them with data centers. And so, that's the kind of thing that I think this administration could do. And I think, there's an opportunity just for them to think creatively in those types of ways.
Right. Well, just back on the order, I don't know, David, if you want to come in. I do think there's a good point that you raised. I mean, there are a lot of real issues, regulatory issues, permitting issues. I mean, is there an opportunity to address some of those things that actually do need to be done through this executive order? I mean, anything else you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think most lawyers, and I'm one, will agree that the calling it an emergency does not bring along new legal authorities, that you've got to deal with the laws that Congress passed and the authority that the president has inherently. The Biden administration was asked by the left to declare a climate emergency, and the Biden administration did not, because they thought it was would be more of a stunt than real policy. I agree with the point that there are a lot of important things that need to be done to help facilitate advances in the electricity sector. And to the extent that this emergency declaration and executive order will facilitate that, I'm all in. But a lot of the authorities are inherent. The categorical exclusions, for example, are already authorized under NEPA, and President Biden used categorical exclusions to facilitate more transmission and other areas. More can be done there, and I hope that it will. I'll just say that excluding solar and wind is, in terms of electricity, is a huge problem. And the offshore wind industry in particular is clearly in the target of this administration. And it has been looked at by the Northeast, which has the best offshore wind in the world. It's an American resource. It's amazing. I'm concerned. I think anyone near the offshore wind energy world is concerned that there'll be attempts to stop the projects that are already permitted, and in any event, stop continued permitting for projects that are in the pipeline. These are multi-billion-dollar projects with enormous economic benefits to the region and to the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there's one thing that's clear, one sector that's clearly in trouble, as a result of this administration's offshore wind. Maybe let's just shift gears completely to talk a little bit about resilience. A lot of the conversation goes quickly to energy policy, but of course we're experiencing more and more climate-related disasters. We could talk specifically about FEMA, which President Trump has said he would like the states to take over the role of FEMA, and he's formed a review council to come up with recommendations on that. So I'd like to ask about that specifically, but then also just to get a sense of how do we think about the way in which this administration is approaching resilience. So what are your concerns? Where are there opportunities, if there are opportunities? We can start with Alice and maybe Michael. I don't know if you want to jump in on this too.
Resilience is more needed than ever because the hotter we get, the bigger events we have. And you just have to look at LA and know that even in California, a heavily prepared state that had invested in adaptation, has an adaptation plan, firefighting capabilities, the city's decimated. And we will see that play out again and again. So you ask about President Trump. I don't think President Trump has signaled a great interest in resilience. He certainly has removed what I believe was the most significant thing that the federal government had accomplished in resilience, and that is, and it sounds so boring, but it saves so much money. It's a building code that says, for all these communities that get flooded all the time, if you're going to build back and take federal dollars, taxpayer dollars to build back, you need to build back resiliently. You need to build back higher. And we know that so the water can flush through. And we know that for every dollar spent on a more resilient building code, you save $11 in recovery. So we have more disasters coming. We know that these areas are already flooding. Let's just raise up these buildings if you are going to build back. Well, he killed it right before Harvey struck in 2017 during his first term. He took that flood standard and said, I don't like it. I think his very first day in office this term, he's killed it again, even though Biden had brought it back. And now he has cut programs that FEMA was running to try to push to the states the need for them to adopt better land use policies as well as building codes. And this is a really disturbing statistic, but 65% of communities and counties in the United States do not have a modern building code. So you could be going and buying a house and think, oh, this is perfectly safe, but it was built to no building code or a building code that's 20 years old and doesn't account for higher winds. So President Trump has said he has pulled back on those programs at FEMA. You've seen resignations, to David's point, of very significant, very experienced leaders at FEMA who had mitigation, not mitigation of emissions, but mitigation of risk efforts. And FEMA is probably one of the centers of activity for that in the United States. And you've seen that states are not necessarily going to have the kind of funding they've had in the past. I do have to put a footnote to this. Under President Trump, in his first administration, he signed legislation that gave the most to states ever for resilience, essentially 6% of all the disaster spending every year. That's still in place as far as I know, but there's a question how that will be spent. In the recovery from Milton and Helene, this administration has decided not to require that things be built back resiliently. That's what FEMA has required in recent years, and this administration has killed that. So we're not going to see, I think, immediately a lot of resilience. I think President Trump's history as a developer probably makes him a little more hostile to codes. You see on the efficiency codes, that's a way to get resiliency by the way, to our energy issues. Better efficiency codes means we use less electricity. So when you have a brownout or you have hot conditions, you don't have to turn down electrical usage if people are using less to start with. So there's hostility there, I think, expressed by this administration, which ultimately will leave us more vulnerable. I will be concerned. I see Sherry Goodman here. I am concerned for the Department of Defense removing the references to climate. Department of Defense has done some great work of adapting their facilities to climate impacts. Think of Norfolk having to raise all those ports so that and facilities. To remove those words from this consideration, both within FEMA as well as the Department of Defense, means that perhaps as we make choices about where we invest, we won't be investing in a way that keeps us safe, because we'll build back to what was there before, which will likely get wiped out again.
That's very, very thorough. Thank you. I don't know, Michael, if you want to come in on that, or if you, anything on the first topic there. I skipped over you on the emergency order.
Yeah, on the emergency order, I mean, that's tricky for a number of reasons. One is, under the National Emergencies Act, there is no definition of emergency. Basically, I think it allows the president, when he declares it, to trigger then all the various emergency authorities that you find in the statutes really here that are relevant for, in this case, I think it's basically for permitting, as Drew was pointing to. And then when you read through the order, they call out specific emergency authorities, whether it's the Clean Water Act, Section 404 for the Army Corps of Engineers, or the so-called God Squad that can convene under the Endangered Species Act. But that's when you do find specific definitions of emergency, and you wonder, when you read them, can they really be applied in certain instances? Maybe with respect to building new infrastructure related to the grid, because I do agree with Drew. When that executive order came together, really the driving theme was the grid. And I think that y'all remember from 2017-18 what happened with FERC and the NOPR that's Secretary Perry sent over to FERC to try to deal with coal plants shutting down. Whether the merits or demerits of that, put that aside, that was 7 years ago. I think the grid is in a much different spot, and I think we have plenty of evidence to back up, whether it's NERC, whether it's the RTOs and ISOs pointing out that, I hate to use the word crisis, but we're pretty much there. And so that's what this emergency order is designed to do. But again, when they call out specific emergency authorities, how are those going to be applied? And when you look at convening the God Squad, you actually have to have a rejected permit in your hand that you can then go back to this committee with and say, hey, committee, this was rejected because we went through a whole long process and we find that we can't actually abide by the various restrictions that were added to our incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act. So all that is to say is, even if the president declares an emergency and then it filters down to the agencies and they use their statutory authorities, there's still a lot of process you have to go through. So it's not like you can snap your fingers and say, go ahead and do this, permit this stuff and build it. And there you go. In a few months, you're off to the races. That's not how it's going to work. And as I said before, you can count on litigation and going to court and testing this authority. I don't think we've had anything like this before. I think President Carter maybe declared an emergency on an energy basis, maybe for a region or two, but never on a national basis like this. So we are in kind of uncharted waters here. And again, it remains to be seen whether courts are going to countenance the use of these authorities to build out infrastructure. Again, depends on the case, depends. Are you talking about the grid? Are you talking about keeping power plants open longer? In which case you go to the Federal Power Act and maybe you're on safer ground there. But if you're talking about building new generation, can you use emergency authorities there? If you're building, say, a combined cycle gas plant, well, what about the gas pipeline to hook up to the plant? Can you use emergency authorities there via FERC to then authorize the construction of that pipeline? So a lot of knotty questions are going into this that are being asked as we speak. And so again, even though you've declared an emergency in the case of the grid, I think it's probably legitimate with respect to the grid. It remains to be seen how this is all going to play out. And again, I think they're going to find that there are a lot of obstacles standing in the way, and without, I keep coming back to it, without help from Congress, it's going to be really hard to effectuate this stuff as quickly as they may think.
So we're at the half-hour mark. I want to turn to the audience in a minute, but I want to ask maybe two more questions here and really sort of zoom us out, because I have a long list of particular policy matters we could discuss, but we don't have time for. So I want to zoom out with a couple of questions. One, we're here in Washington, we're talking about the administration, but of course the energy sector is driven by the market, by market forces. And I just want to, get your sense of to what extent is this administration aligning with the market, providing a tailwind, and to what degree is it pushing against the market forces that are already in play? And then how is the private sector sort of manage that dynamic? How are you seeing companies manage that dynamic? I'd open it to anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I think we're seeing different thumbs being put on different scales. And certainly with the Biden administration, a thumb one way, and now a thumb a different way. The challenge is, I think it's very difficult at this particular moment to know exactly how the market forces are working. If you're stepping back truly globally, you look at South Africa and Pakistan, and solar energy is just sweeping across those countries, really threatening their grids. So market forces are taking over in unexpected ways. And then you have, I found it very interesting. The Wall Street Journal had on the same day, I saw two headlines. The Unstoppable Energy Transition was the Wall Street Journal's editorial headline. And then in our own CFR, it was something like the Troubled Transition. And it's very difficult to parse these things out. And then you, of course, have Europe that in the wake of the election of President Trump has begun to pull back on some of their thumbs on the market, most notably their taxonomy and their disclosure requirements, so that they can be more competitive in this market. And then you have the states stepping in or amping up their efforts, California on disclosure requirements, trying to adjust the market. For me, this is not a free market on any, there's just interference occurring everywhere. But I will say, if you really step back on the markets, I agree with Sir Nicholas Stern, who determined that climate change is the biggest market failure ever, because we do not price the externalities of this pollution that's occurring. And we still haven't approached being able to price that accurately yet, no matter whose thumb is where.
Do you mention the hyperscalers? I mean, it might be worth just talking about that briefly.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think the market, so to speak, is going to move forward with or without policy. And in many cases, in this case particular, it might be policy's best role to get out of the way. Now, get out of the way doesn't mean completely pull back. I am a free marketeer, but I also recognize that energy in particular, as Alice noted, does not live in a free market. It's highly regulated and subsidized here in the US. It's subsidized globally. So I get all that. I just want to lean into freer and freer markets with more market competition as much as possible. And when you look at the growth of AI, and the demand that's going to be required for that, I feel like every day I see a new estimate, but it's, 3x by the next 10 years or something. 25% of the growth, I think, is projected to be specifically just in AI. The energy is needed. We need as much energy as fast as possible. And I think we can all agree we want it as clean as possible. Now, people have different definitions of clean. My view is that we want it to be cleaner and cleaner over time. I still view natural gas as being part of the clean energy mix. And I think we also have to be realistic that, again, while I like solar, solar has trade-offs, and every form of energy has trade-offs. And so I just hope that we can be realistic and practical. And when it comes to the market, these decisions are mostly made and best made just on pure investment. And so, you know, I just came off of a call with a billionaire who's, you know, on the left side of the aisle. You know, I'm not a billionaire, but I'm on the right side of the aisle. And we couldn't agree more about the need to invest in more energy faster around the world and to have it be cleaner and cleaner over time. Now, is that because of climate? Well, it's because of climate for some. It's not because of climate for others. You know, others might be more focused on resilience, might be more focused on economic security and economic freedom. So then that's where I pull back from this conversation of this president and his impact on the climate. You know, what we need is more energy, faster, cleaner. And whether you want that for climate reasons or other reasons, no matter what, that's what we need. And so how do we get that is the question. And we can argue all day long, I think, about the impact of us being in or out of the Paris Agreement. But in 100 years from now, I think if we build faster, cleaner, we will all be better off, including the climate. And so that's just where I think Trump has the opportunity by, I mean, he mentioned in his State of the Union last night, or I guess it's not technically a State of the Union, but, you know, cutting 10 regulations for every one regulation. That has a big opportunity here if we can actually harness that towards energy.
So David, looks like you're eager to jump in maybe, but even if not, I'm going to ask one final question. I would ask each of you to limit to just like a few sentences on this question. And David, if you want to come in on anything there, that's fine as well. But this last question is just, you know, we talked about signal, noise, skipped over a lot of the actual policy levers here. But maybe if you could just say what you think the actual most significant energy or climate policy decision in these last 6 weeks has been, with 2 sentences of explanation, and then we'll go to audience questions. And David, you can start.
Sure, because it follows. I think the most significant move potentially, and I hope I'm wrong about this, is the exclusion from that executive order of solar, wind, and storage. And my worry is that what's happening to the offshore wind industry will become a contagion in terms of the lieutenants of the president being against clean energy. That can't be the case. I hope. I agree so much with Drew. Our electricity system is growing, and we need to feed it. And clean energy is got to be a key part. What's most overblown, I would say, is drill, baby, drill. But I worry about that not because of that we may be drilling more if we can. It is that we don't need a license here to potentially go to places that are sensitive, and we don't need to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Industry doesn't want it. And I hope that we will not go overboard as a country because of drill, baby, drill. There's tremendous opportunity to continue to grow on the footprint the oil and gas industry has in the United States, and they've done a fantastic job of making the most of it.
Thank you. Great. So let's just go Alice, Michael, Drew. And again, if you can, just very briefly so we can get a lot of audience questions in.
Well, I'm going to give you something very near term. It's the threat to our weather science agencies. We cannot duplicate what they do, and they are seeing massive letting go of meteorologists, closing of radar stations that track tornadoes. So very difficult to be prepared if you don't have a good forecast. And so that is the thing that I worry about the most. That is the first step in being resilient, is you have to know what the weather is.
Great.
I think the most significant thing that hasn't maybe even talked about enough is I think the administration, the EPA's decision to overturn the endangerment finding under the Clean Air Act for greenhouse gas emissions. That will have enormous ramifications for the regulatory sort of superstructure that governs transportation vehicles, Title I under the Clean Air Act, stationary sources, power plants, and the like, oil and gas facilities. And it could lead eventually, we'll see, to potentially going back to the Supreme Court and seeing the Supreme Court overturning the Mass v. EPA decision from 2007. It was a 5-4 decision. And it's possible the Supreme Court could revisit that and find that, CO2 and greenhouse gases are not pollutants under the Clean Air Act, were never intended to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. That will be a huge decision one way or the other. Wherever you come down on it, that looks like that decision is going to be moving forward. I think maybe the most overblown that I've seen was the executive order governing greater assertion of presidential authority over independent agencies. I think particularly with respect to FERC. Understand the concern, certainly. You want to make sure you're carving out that space for those agencies to operate. I would say from working in the first term, as Chair Christie said, it was pretty standard fare to take major rulemakings and send them to OIRA for review. There's other parts of that I think are not as well understood. The idea that the Attorney General and the Office of Legal Counsel has sort of the final say on legal matters in the executive branch. I'm not sure that's a big deal. Again, I don't think you're going to see the White House intervening and telling FERC what to do. But anyway, that's one that's getting a lot of ink, and I think it's a little overheated.
I'll just say two things. One, as folks know, in Washington, people are policy. And so I think having Chris Wright as the Secretary of Energy is really important. Someone that, again, understands business, geology, science, and energy. And his entire team that he's put together is impressive. The Deputy Secretary nominee, Danley, comes from FERC and understands those many challenges around infrastructure and wires. So I think that's one. The other is cutting back on regulations. I mean, we've been talking about permitting reform for I don't know how long around Washington. We've kind of gotten close, but never really gotten it done. If we can get that done under this administration by cutting back the 10-for-1 regulations or by whatever is done through this Energy and Environment Task Force, I think that's significant.
That's great. Okay, let's have some audience questions. We can go with Sherry, and then maybe let's do two at a time. Go Sherry, and then up here as well.
Okay, thank you all. Great discussion, Sherry Goodman, Wilson Center and Center for Climate Security. So I agree that we could use military bases and other federal lands, national labs to be early first movers on nuclear, geothermal, and other clean energy. And they're already, I mean, DI, Defense Innovation Unit, is already working that for geothermal and nuclear. And has done a lot of siting in the past, but it's really not enough for the energy demand that we face nationally or globally. So, and we've had, I just want to focus on nuclear for a minute, since we have, there's been a global goal to triple our deployment of nuclear energy, and the US, which used to be a leader in nuclear energy, is no longer the one with the big order book globally on nuclear. Now it's China and Russia and the Koreans. We're poised to do more on nuclear, but there's military bases that aren't going to be enough. We need a lot more investment. And it's not just the generation, I know, as Drew and others know, it's the transmission and a lot of decisions that seem to me are not necessarily going to be made by the federal government. And so here's my question for any of you, which is, if we're going to have like a 10-to-1, what are your regulations that you would get rid of? And how would you solve the issue about getting more clean, decarbonized electricity from any source on the grid with all the wires and poles and other networks that we actually need that aren't in the federal government's primary control?
Great. I think if we take two questions, and that way we can have, they can choose which to answer. So I think we have one up here as well.
Hi, Simone Williams, former DOD. My question is actually going to pull more on what we've been talking about with like the Paris Accords and everything, in the sense of we've seen Bloomberg Foundation say that they're going to step up and help fund the UN Climate Council. The executive branch provides priorities and direction. But if the executive branch is no longer going to do that, what is your optimism in the fact that other businesses will step up and take that role?
Great. Okay. Does anyone want to start with either of them?
I'll just address Sherry's point about nuclear and DoD. I agree. I mean, the DoD and National Lab facilities aren't enough. I think there again, I think you could add to the mix by siting data centers there. And so then you're actually reducing not only the demand at the lab, but you're reducing future demand on site. And then, yeah, you know, I think, yeah, from a nuclear standpoint, I mean, I just think we need to be all in here. So I'm totally with you there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the point. I do think there's a sense that, you know, when we encounter these problems with the grid, that there's a fallback to say, well, we'll just go to military facilities and that will help move us towards solving the problem, which again, I don't want to discount it, but you're right that it's, and then there's also talk a lot about using the Defense Production Act. And that's a very unwieldy instrument to address the seriousness of this problem and the swiftness with which we need to deal with it. I think all eyes are on FERC right now on this question right now, particularly in terms of co-location and behind the meter. FERC is doing what it can. I think Chairman Christie is doing a great job, but I do think FERC needs to move faster and they need to move much bigger. You know, they just did a show cause order with PJM. They rejected the Talon AWS deal from last year, but companies are just desperate. They're hungry for FERC to say, here's what the rules are. Here's how they apply at the federal level in terms of wholesale markets. And here's the demarcation between federal and state authorities. Go forth and build these things. There's so much confusion right now. No one knows what the rules are. This is an area where, as a free market guy, you want to have policy. You want to have intervention, particularly by the federal government in this case, to make sure that folks understand what the rules are so they can go invest and build. And that, to me, to address your issue, your question, if FERC has to really step up and, again, I think sort of broaden its lens to take this issue on.
Can I jump
I
in
just
on
wanted
that?
to quickly, oh, go ahead. Oh, David, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, David, and then we'll.
Okay, just wanted to jump in full support of what Michael was saying there. You know, the electricity and transmission, the constraints here to build out our grid better is largely not a regulatory problem. You know, Rob Gremlich talks about the 3 Ps: the paying, the permitting, the planning. The planning and the paying are both in FERC's bailiwick, and they've been slow about it. They're moving now, but the financing issues are huge, particularly for those interregional merchant lines where it's not clear how they're going to get paid for, and where the local utilities are disincentivized to support those things. And then the permitting side, there's certainly room for reform in transmission, in particular, with the federal government, frankly, playing a bigger role. Because right now, it's, to the extent there are regulatory problems, a lot of it, for certainly the big lines, is at the state level, because they're disapproving these things. They don't see what it's in their benefit. So we need a broader discussion, frankly, about regulations, particularly if we're looking for building infrastructure that includes states and local restrictions as well.
I just wanted to respond to your question. I don't see the private sector stepping up right now. We see in the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the major banks have walked away from that, walking away from their net zero. We're seeing fossil fuel companies, British Petroleum, Shell walking away from their commitments. So I'm not seeing that this is going to be driven in this climate, at least publicly, by the private sector. And there's also, of course, the litigation risk over ESG. The red state attorney generals have said they'll sue for failure of following your fiduciary duty if you corporation relies on ESG factors. There's an interesting aspect of that. With the environmental, I think that I'm a former judge and a lawyer, so I think there's a flip side. I think there's a liability side growing for companies, for directly, we've already seen this for fossil fuel companies. They're being sued widely for their emissions, and there's much better science to point to the level of emissions. There was a report just today saying, I think it's just 36 companies cause 50% of the carbon since 1856. So that makes it better lawsuit when you can point to 50%. They call what percentage of theirs was 50%. And I think you'll also see liability for companies not adequately considering climate risk. Even though we don't have disclosure requirements, there's going to be harm from climate risk. And at this point, it's foreseeable. We know that we will have bigger storms, more flooding. And if you decided to put something in harm's way, causing harm, for example, you don't have adequate generators in a nursing home and people die, there'll be liability. And they may not call it climate, but it will be climate caused.
I want to just say one quick comment on that. I mean, the contrast between 2017, Trump elected, and at COP, more than 300 companies signing up and saying, we're still in. And, I think there was radio silence after this last election. But I think a good question to ask is how our internal, operations, CapEx actually changing? And, you mentioned the Net Zero Banking Alliance. How did operations at the banks that pulled out actually change after they pulled out? And I think the answer would probably be not so much, but it's harder to get them to talk about it. So anyway, I know we have a question on the Zoom, and then we'll go back to the room.
We will take our next question from Neely Gilbert.
Hello, I'm Neely Gilbert, the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct. Thank you for this discussion. We can't have a session on climate and energy without talking about carbon pricing. And I'd actually like to ask about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs, in US policy, where, as you know, countries tax imported goods based upon the amount of pollution that's required to produce them. Certainly in the US, we've actually already seen some legislation proposed in Congress by Democrats, also by Republicans, and a bipartisan proposal. But different advantages are in focus, not just concern for climate, but carbon tariffs as a potential revenue source for budget reconciliation, competitiveness with others who may have CBAMs, or also countries like China that have higher emissions embedded in their goods. So I wanted to ask what you all think about, do you think that we may see progress on this in the current administration and environment, and how would you evaluate the merits or demerits of CBAMs in the US or elsewhere? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think, I have questions/concerns about a CBAM and can it be effectively administered? I mean, China has manipulated currency for I don't know how long. So if we can create such a mechanism that China can't manipulate, then I'm perhaps more interested. But I will say, if you're an advocate for the CBAM, I think the next 4 years is your probably best window, because as you mentioned, you've got Republican and Democrat support for different reasons, perhaps, but it definitely fits into this tariffs discussion with the president talking about things being reciprocal.
Do you, maybe just like a reality check on it? I mean, do you think there's a lot of talk in the fall about this as being a, potential opportunity, especially in the budget conversations? I mean, what do you actually, is that real?
I don't think it is. It's an interesting discussion, and the questioner is exactly right. It was interesting to see that there's bipartisan legislation on this, but it really hasn't gotten much traction, as you say. And I certainly haven't heard it being discussed in the context of the reconciliation bill. I think when you talk to the administration, when you talk to the White House, USTR, Commerce, they are somewhat intrigued by the concept, but they then will turn it immediately to the existing authority that they already have under trade laws, that they think, well, if this is a problem, well, we'll just use the existing authorities that the president already has, which are quite expansive. And if we find that there are inequities, we can remedy them that way. If there are manufacturing inequities, or again, a lot of this would be directed towards China, and they feel like they have plenty tools already in the toolbox. I do think for Republicans as well, just to get political here, at least to describe the politics, that when this concept really started gaining traction in the media after I think Senator Cassidy introduced his bill, there are a lot of groups on the right that basically just said, well, this is just a carbon tax. And that effort was pretty darn effective at scaring, I think, a lot of Republicans away. I don't believe Senator Cassidy, maybe with one exception, got any Republican co-sponsors on his bill. Not to denigrate his efforts. I think he's done a fine job, staff, friends of mine. And but again, I think that's just the reality, the political reality, that this, for a lot of Republicans, is too close to the sun. They see it just as sort of a stalking horse for a carbon tax. And that's really politically where the difficulty lies.
Let's be really.
Can I jump in?
If you want to come in very, very quickly. Yes. Yeah.
I would just want to put something else on the table. I agree with these comments. I do think if Europe starts implementing it aggressively, it'll be interesting to see. It could be that we realize that we have lower carbon products as well that help us, and that could change the political equation, I would think. I just want to mention that real quickly, because it goes to the trade issue. If the tariffs go on electricity coming from Canada to the US, we're going to have a big issue. That's with Quebec Hydro, et cetera, these huge transmission lines now being built, bringing energy down, prices going up, et cetera. So I just thank the questioner for raising the geopolitical issue here in the energy context, because it's relevant.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's be very bold and have two questions. If you could try to make them brief, and maybe I'll just go with these two folks right in the middle. But please be brief so we can try to get to both of them.
This goes to the geopolitical. How much advantage are we giving China for the future market penetration, et cetera, with all sorts of green energy, grid technology, batteries, et cetera? And then also in terms of those externalities, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has been speaking extensively about the fact that we could end up in a mortgage crisis and a housing crisis because of the lack of insurance for places with wildfires and flooding. So I just wanted to ask you guys of the economics of both of those.
Great.
Back to the geopolitics, the US in the recent 3 years in climate negotiations or in the side discussions, I've been on panels with US diplomats. They've all been pushing critical minerals. How do you see that playing out, Alice, in all of this discussion? The fight over geopolitics over critical minerals. Second, will IRA be dismantled, the Inflation Reduction Act? I think industry was happy about it.
Okay, a lot of big questions very quickly.
Okay.
How much time do we have?
I'll just say, I think China is going to be a big winner. Their cars are going to be exported, and already they're a winner in the clean energy space. The property insurance, don't underestimate that. I do a lot of work on the property insurance issues. It's coming to you. It's coming to all of us. And we do not have the resilience in place to make this attractive to private insurers who are, just want to make a profit every year, and they only give you a contract every year. So their solution is they'll get out of the market. That will put huge pressure on the federal government to do something. I think this discussion on critical minerals, I think it's really hard to know what will take place at in the UN without the US president. We won't be a part of that, but obviously President Trump is trying to advance his agenda on critical minerals. And I have no idea whether the IRA is going to be overturned or not, but maybe some of these folks who are better at reading the crystal ball of Donald Trump than I am, and the Congress.
Well, yeah, on the IRA question, you're absolutely right that many businesses are up on the Hill as we speak, arguing to protect, preserve any number of the credits. I think the House is interesting because you have a 2-seat margin, and you do have any number of Republicans who want to see these credits stay in the books, but you probably have a lot more in the House Republican Conference who want to see them go away. And I think that includes the House Republican leadership. And I think what they're finding at the leadership level is there's just it's too hard to adjudicate between all the different members coming to them and saying, well, I want 45V or I want 45Q or keep you. So their sense is, well, is it easiest just to get rid of it all? And I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think you have biofuels credits that, the biofuels industry is very powerful and probably going to preserve their credits. I think the nuclear credits are probably safe just because there's such strong support for nuclear. Things like 45Q in the Senate, when you think about who was, the architects of 45Q, you've got Senator Barrasso, who's the majority whip. You got Senator Kramer and Hoeven and Capito as chair of EPW. I don't think they're going to allow those credits to go by the wayside. And so while there's a lot of noise, speaking of noise, at the end of the day, I do think you're going to see a number of these credits stay. They may not look like they look today. Maybe they're less generous. Maybe the scope is reduced. Are there some that are very vulnerable, more vulnerable than others? Yes, the 30D credit for EV, the consumer credit probably goes away, maybe goes away over a year or two. So there's kind of a continuum of vulnerability, but some of these will survive, I think, at the end of the day.
David, do you have a 15-second last comment? Then I'm going to wrap.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I give you 15 seconds.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Use it wisely.
Thank you to this great panel. I think we covered a lot of ground, so much more we could have. It'll be interesting to revisit in a year where all of these things land. But thank you to this panel. Thanks.
Thanks.